My name is Thomas Walker, and I am 32 years old. I work as a surveyor for the county, which means I spend most of my days out in the wilderness mapping land and taking measurements. Because of this profession, I know the Appalachian Mountains better than most people. I know the trails, the hollers, the creeks, and the hidden places where civilization feels like a distant memory. That knowledge did not save us. If anything, it may have made things worse. I need to tell this story because people need to know what exists out there in those mountains. They need to know that some of the old folklore, the stories that generations of mountain people have whispered around fires for centuries, those stories are not just tales told to frighten children. Some of them are warnings, real warnings about real things. It was the summer of 2018 when this happened. July, specifically. The kind of July when the heat sits in the hollers like an invisible weight, and the humidity makes every breath feel like you are drinking the air itself. I had invited a group of friends and acquaintances to join me on a week-long camping trip. I thought it would be good for them. I thought it would be an adventure. I was wrong about that. Charles Harris was one of the first to confirm. He was 68 years old, retired from working at the textile mill for 40 years. Charles was the kind of man who had not left the county in nearly 2 decades. His wife had passed away 5 years before our trip, and his daughter was always trying to get him to do something, anything, to break him out of the routine he had fallen into. Charles seemed excited about the idea. He said he wanted to see the high mountains again, wanted to breathe the air up there where it was clean and thin. Nancy Clark, age 47, was a school teacher. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school and had been one of my casual friends for about 3 years. We would run into each other at the community store or at church functions, and we would talk about books and hiking. Nancy was the kind of person who seemed to be always reading, always thinking about things beyond our small mountain town. She wanted to photograph the wildflowers that bloom in the high elevations during summer. She brought a professional camera and 2 lenses. Joseph Lewis was 50 years old. He owned a hardware store in town, and I had bought supplies from him countless times. Joseph was sturdy, practical, and knowledgeable about outdoor equipment. He had grown up in the mountains, as had we all, but he seemed to have no interest in returning to those wild places. He told me he was only coming because his wife insisted he needed a week away from the store. I think he felt obligated. I do not think he wanted to be there. Margaret Robinson was 75 years old, and she was the most concerning person to invite. Margaret was Charles Harris's sister, and she had health issues. She had diabetes and a heart condition that required medication. Her doctor had said she should not undertake strenuous activities, but Margaret was stubborn. She said she had been in those mountains her entire life, and she would not let her body dictate where she could and could not go. She said she wanted to see the place where she and Charles had played as children, near a creek they called Raven Branch. No one pushed too hard when she said she was coming. Thomas Walker was another person in the group, but that is me, so I will describe myself briefly. I am a healthy man who has spent most of his adult life in wilderness. I am cautious, but I am not easily frightened. I have encountered bears, come across copperheads, survived a lightning strike during a storm on an open ridge. I thought I understood danger. I thought I understood the mountains. I was arrogant about what I knew. The last member of our party was Donna Hall, age 59. Donna worked as a nurse at the county hospital. She and her husband had been friends with Charles Harris for decades. She volunteered immediately when Charles mentioned he was going on the trip. Donna was the caretaker type. She was always making sure other people had what they needed. She was the one who insisted that Margaret come, despite her health concerns. She said she would watch out for Margaret. She said everything would be fine. We planned the trip meticulously. I had chosen a location in a remote part of the mountains, about 4 hours' drive northeast of our town. The place was called Cumberland Hollow, and it was a place I had surveyed about 2 years before our trip. The hollow was located in a bowl between 3 high ridges, and there was a creek running through it that was cold and clear. The hiking trails around the area were well maintained, though they saw few visitors because of the remote location. I arranged for us to use a ranger station cabin that was located about a half-mile from where we planned to camp. The ranger station had running water and electricity, which meant Margaret could keep her insulin in a refrigerator, and there was a bathroom available if anyone needed it in the middle of the night. This made people more comfortable about the trip. This made them feel safer. We met at my house on a Friday morning in the middle of July. Everyone arrived between 8 and 9 o'clock. We packed the 2 vehicles that we were using with camping equipment, food, coolers, first aid supplies, and everything else we thought we might need. Charles seemed energetic, almost boyish about the whole thing. He kept talking about how beautiful the mountains were, how he had forgotten what that beauty felt like. Nancy was excited too. She kept checking her camera equipment, making sure everything was working properly. Joseph seemed distant, but he helped us load the vehicles without complaining. Margaret was quieter than the others. She moved slowly, carefully, and her breathing seemed labored even just from the activity of loading gear. Donna stayed close to Margaret, monitoring her, checking if she needed to rest. Donna was already in nurse mode, already thinking about Margaret's health and safety. We drove north and east for 4 hours. The landscape changed as we climbed higher. The towns became smaller and fewer. The forests became thicker and darker. The roads became narrower and more winding. By the time we reached the access road that led down into Cumberland Hollow, we had not seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. The access road was rough. It was barely more than a logging road, with 2 ruts worn deep by tires and overgrown grass growing between them. Both vehicles bounced and jolted as we drove down into the hollow. The forest here was dense. Hemlock trees towered overhead, and the undergrowth was thick. It was so dark under the trees that it felt like twilight even though it was still mid-morning. We drove for about 3 miles on that rough road before we reached the ranger station. It was a small building made of wood, with a metal roof that showed signs of rust. There was a small clearing in front of it, and beyond that, a trail led deeper into the forest toward where we planned to set up base camp. The ranger station was locked, but I had the key. I opened it up and we went inside. It was a basic structure. There was a main room with a wood stove, a table, some chairs, a cot, and shelves with various supplies. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove and a refrigerator powered by a generator. There was 1 bathroom. The building was clean and well maintained, but it smelled like old wood and dampness. We unloaded our vehicles and brought our gear inside and set it out. Margaret immediately sat down at the table and pulled out her blood sugar testing kit. She checked herself while Donna stood nearby, watching. Charles walked around the cabin, touching the walls, looking at things. Nancy gazed out the window at the forest outside. Joseph asked me how far it was to where we would set up our main camp. I told him it was about 1.5 miles from the ranger station, back up the hollow toward where Raven Branch Creek ran through. The cabin was our safety net. The cabin was where we could retreat to if anyone got hurt or if the weather turned bad. The cabin was supposed to be our security. We rested for a while at the ranger station, ate some sandwiches for lunch, and then organized our camping gear. We would take only what we needed for the week, leaving the heavier supplies in the cooler with extra food at the station. Charles and Nancy volunteered to make a supply run back to the station after a few days to restock food. It seemed like a reasonable plan. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we set off into the forest. I led the way on the trail, which was narrow and winding. The canopy above was so thick that we walked in shade the entire time. The air was cool and smelled like earth and decomposing leaves and something else that I could not quite identify. Something that smelled old and wrong, but I did not think much about it at the time. We walked for about an hour before we reached our campsite. It was a clearing beside Raven Branch Creek, just as I had remembered it. The water in the creek was running clear over rocks, and the sound of it was soothing. There was plenty of space to set up tents. There were several flat areas that looked like previous camping parties had used them. Charles seemed pleased when he saw the place. He walked over to the creek and sat down on a large rock, staring at the water. He seemed to be remembering something from his childhood. Donna came and sat beside him, not saying anything, just being present with him. Nancy was immediately taking photographs. She was photographing the creek, the trees, the light filtering through the canopy. She seemed happy. Margaret sat down carefully on a log and let Donna give her a bottle of water and some snacks. Joseph helped me set up the first tent. We worked quietly together, and I remember thinking that it was good to have his practical help. We set up 6 tents in a rough circle around the clearing. We arranged them so that there was a central area where we could sit together and so that no one was isolated. We set up a fire ring using rocks from the creek bed. We organized the coolers and supplies in a central location. By the time we finished, it was after 5 o'clock. The sun was already sinking lower in the sky, and the shadows in the forest were getting longer and darker. I remember looking around at the setup and feeling satisfied. It looked safe. It looked like a good place to spend a week in the mountains. That was our first mistake. We thought our tents and our circle meant something. We thought proximity meant safety. We thought that 6 people together in the forest meant we were protected from whatever might be out there in the dark. That night, we built a fire and cooked dinner. Nancy and I made a meal of grilled chicken and vegetables and rice. We sat around the fire as evening descended, and we talked. Charles told stories about his childhood in these mountains, about hunting trips he had taken with his father, about creeks he had fished in. Nancy asked questions and listened carefully. Joseph seemed more relaxed after a day of physical activity. Margaret ate carefully, watching her portions, and Donna made sure she had everything she needed. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, the conversation shifted. Someone asked if there were any old stories about the area, any mountain folklore or local legends. I did not want to tell them. I did not think it was appropriate for a first night, but Charles was already smiling, already leaning forward with interest. Nancy had her phone out, ready to take notes or record stories. And there was something about sitting around a fire in the dark forest that made people want to tell stories. That made people want to acknowledge that they were deep in wild country, far from civilization, in a place where strange things might exist. So I told them about the Talipo. The Talipo is an old Appalachian folklore creature. How old? No one really knows. The stories about it go back at least 100 years, maybe much further. There are versions of the tale told throughout the Appalachian region, and there are similar creatures in Cherokee and other Native American folklore. The Talipo is described as a small creature, about the size of a large cat or small dog, with the head of a fox or a cat, the body of a weasel, and a long tail. The tail is distinctive. It is very long, and it is tufted at the end like a lioness tail or a fox tail. The creature is said to be nocturnal. It comes out in the darkness to hunt. According to the old stories, the Talipo is not inherently evil or dangerous. It is a wild animal, like any other, but it is also territorial, and it is vengeful. If you harm the Talipo, if you injure it or kill it, the creature will seek revenge. It will follow you. It will haunt you. It will come for you at night. And according to the stories, it will repeat its name over and over, wailing and crying out into the darkness. The stories say that the creature's call is distinctive. It sounds like a wailing cry, a haunting sound that echoes through the forest. They say if you hear the Talipo calling your name, you are in terrible danger. I told this story while we sat around the fire, and I told them the most specific version of the tale, the one that involves a hunter who caught a Talipo in a trap and skinned it, thinking it was a different animal. The creature came back every night, wailing and crying outside his cabin, calling out into the darkness. It scratched at his door and his windows. On the final night, when the man thought he had driven it away for good, the creature came into his cabin and killed him. That is how the story ends. Nancy was fascinated. She asked me if I believed the story was true. I told her that it was folklore, that it was a story people told, but that I did not know if it was literally true. Charles seemed amused by the tale. He did not seem frightened. Joseph had barely listened. He was looking at the fire, but Margaret had gone very still. Her breathing seemed shallow. Donna noticed and asked if she was okay. Margaret said she was fine, just tired, but I saw the expression on Margaret's face, and I saw something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Fear, definitely. We let the fire die down, and we went to our tents around 11 o'clock. I remember climbing into my sleeping bag and thinking about the stories I had told. I remember thinking that I should not have told them. I remember thinking about Margaret's expression. Outside, in the darkness of the Appalachian forest, beyond the circle of our camp, something was moving in the shadows. Something was hunting. But I did not know that yet. I did not understand what we were about to face. That was the first night in Cumberland Hollow. The next morning, everything seemed fine. The sun rose over the ridge to the east, and the forest was full of light and birdsong. We made breakfast around the fire. Charles had recovered his good mood. Nancy had already taken dozens of photographs. Joseph seemed content to simply sit and drink his coffee. Margaret seemed fine, though Donna continued to watch her carefully. I did not know that the night would bring a very different atmosphere. That second day was a hiking day. We planned to hike up to a ridge that overlooked the entire hollow. The view from there was supposed to be spectacular, and the trail was well maintained and not too strenuous. I thought it would be good for the group. I thought physical activity and fresh air and beautiful scenery would be good for everyone. We prepared a lunch of sandwiches and filled our water bottles at the creek. Nancy brought her camera, of course. Charles was enthusiastic again. He kept talking about how many years it had been since he had hiked a trail like this. Joseph packed the cooler and seemed willing to go. Margaret was quieter. She tested her blood sugar before we set out, and she took her medication. Donna made sure Margaret had extra snacks and water and said she would stay close to her the entire hike. The trail began at the western edge of our campsite and climbed gradually up the ridgeline. The forest was thick with hemlock and spruce and oak. The ground beneath our feet was soft with decades of fallen leaves and pine needles. The air was cool and fresh. We walked at a steady pace, and for the first few hours, it was pleasant. We reached a ridge crest at about 1 o'clock. There was a clearing there with a view of the entire hollow. To the south, we could see the mountains rising in layers of blue and gray, fading into haze. To the north and west, more mountains. The sky was partly cloudy, and the light was clear and bright. Nancy took photographs for a long time. Charles sat on a flat rock and simply looked out at the view, not saying anything, tears running down his face. I asked if he was okay. He said yes, he was fine. He was just happy to see this again, this beauty, this wild country. He said he had forgotten how much he loved these mountains. We ate lunch at the ridge. Everyone seemed content. Even Joseph seemed to be enjoying himself. Margaret was breathing hard from the climb, but she said she felt fine. Donna gave her some extra water and some crackers with honey for her blood sugar. On the way back down the trail, Nancy got ahead of the group. She wanted to get some photographs of the forest light filtering through the trees, and she moved faster than the rest of us. I considered telling her to stay with the group, but she was on the marked trail and she was not far ahead. I did not think there was any danger in her going a little faster. We were about halfway back to camp when we heard Nancy scream. It was not a scream of pain. It was a scream of shock and surprise and fear. We all heard it, and we all stopped moving. Charles asked what was wrong. I told everyone to stay where they were, and I started moving toward the sound of Nancy's voice. I found her about 100 yards down the trail. She was standing in the middle of the path, her camera held against her chest, and she was staring at something on the ground. Her face was pale. She was shaking. I asked her what was wrong. She pointed at the ground. There was a deer on the trail. It was a young doe, probably only a year old or so, but something had killed it. Something had torn open its side. The wound was ragged and deep, and the ground around the deer was covered with blood. The deer was still warm, which meant it had died only recently. Within the last hour or so, maybe within the last few minutes, I knelt down and looked at the wound more carefully. This was not a predator kill that I recognized. A bear would have killed it differently. A mountain lion might have done it, but the wound seemed too ragged for that, and the pattern was wrong. Coyotes were too small to kill a deer like this, and they would have approached it differently. This wound looked like it had been made by claws, by multiple claws, tearing and ripping at the animal. Joseph came down the trail behind me and looked at the dead deer. He said it was not natural. He said he did not know what had made a wound like that. Charles and Margaret and Donna arrived, and we all stood there looking at the carcass. Margaret's face had gone white. She looked like she might collapse. Donna held her arm and asked if she was okay. Margaret did not answer. She was staring at the dead deer with an expression of pure dread. I told everyone that we needed to get back to camp. I said it might have been a bear, or it might have been a wild dog pack, and we should not linger in the area. No one argued. Nancy was still shaking, and Charles helped her back down the trail. But I was thinking about the Talipo. I was thinking about the stories, about the folklore, and I was thinking that the wound on that deer looked too deliberate, too vicious, to be a natural predator kill. We returned to camp and said nothing more about the dead deer. We tried to have a normal evening. We made dinner and sat around the fire. Charles asked me if there were many predators in these mountains. I told him there were bears, and possibly a mountain lion, though they were rare. I did not mention the Talipo, but I think everyone was thinking about it. I think the dead deer had reminded everyone of the stories, reminded everyone of all the old warnings embedded in Appalachian folklore. That night, as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I heard something outside. It was a sound I could not identify. It was like a wailing cry, distant and faint, coming from somewhere in the forest. It sounded almost like an animal in pain or distress. It sounded almost like something calling out a name. I told myself it was an owl. I told myself it was a fox or a coyote. I told myself it was my imagination, amplified by the stories I had told and the dead deer we had found. But deep down, I was beginning to be afraid. The third day was when things began to change in a way that I could not explain away. We did not take a long hike that day. Margaret was tired, and Donna recommended that we have a rest day. Instead, we spent the day around the camp. Nancy did some photography around the creek. Joseph sat by the fire and read a book. Charles helped me gather firewood, though we did not need much. Margaret rested in her tent with Donna nearby, making sure she had everything she needed. In the afternoon, I noticed something strange. There were tracks around the campsite, animal tracks. I had not noticed them before, but that does not mean they were not there. They were paw prints, 4 toes and a pad, like a cat or a small canine. But the prints were strange. They were too large for a domestic animal, but they seemed too small for a bear, and they circled the campsite. They came close to each tent, and then moved away. They were everywhere. Joseph noticed them too. He asked me what had made the tracks. I said I did not know. I said they were probably coyote or fox tracks, and they had probably been made over a period of days. But I did not think that was true. I thought the tracks were fresh. I thought they had been made the night before, while we were all sleeping in our tents. That night, I almost did not sleep at all. I lay in my tent listening to every sound. Around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard it again, that wailing cry coming from the forest. But this time it was closer. And this time, it sounded less like an animal and more like something else. Something that almost sounded like it was calling out a word. I got out of my tent and looked around the campsite. The fire had burned down to embers. The other tents were dark and quiet. I did not see anything moving in the shadows beyond the camp, but I felt something. I felt a presence. I felt like something was out there in the dark, just beyond the light from the dying fire, watching us. I sat by the fire for an hour, feeding it wood, keeping it bright. Around 4 o'clock, the sound stopped. I went back to my tent, but I did not sleep. The next morning, I asked if anyone else had heard the sounds. No one admitted to hearing anything. Nancy said she had slept heavily. Charles said he had heard something, but he thought it was an owl or some other night animal, and he had not thought much of it. Joseph did not say anything. But Donna asked if we should perhaps consider cutting the trip short. She said Margaret seemed stressed, and stress was not good for her heart condition. I did not want to leave. Something in me was stubborn about it. I thought we should not retreat. I thought if we left now, we would always be afraid of these mountains, and I could not accept that. These mountains were my home. I could not abandon them out of fear based on strange sounds and animal tracks. But I should have listened to Donna. I should have insisted that we leave immediately. That night, we built the fire larger than we had before. We all sat close to it. We did not talk much. Around 10 o'clock, Charles said he was tired and he went to his tent. Nancy followed about an hour later. Joseph went to bed not long after. Donna stayed by the fire with Margaret, and I remained awake, feeding the fire, keeping it bright and hot. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, it came. There was a sound from the forest, a sound like nothing I had ever heard before. It was a wailing cry, high-pitched and haunting, and it echoed through the hollow. And in that cry, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I heard what sounded like a word. It sounded like it was calling out a name. It sounded like it was calling out for Margaret. Margaret stood up suddenly from where she had been sitting. Her face was absolutely terrified. She grabbed Donna's arm so hard that Donna cried out in pain. She said, "No. No, it cannot be. It is not possible. It cannot have found us here." I asked her what she was talking about. What was calling her name? What did she know about that sound? Margaret's hands were shaking. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, too rapid. Donna was trying to calm her down, saying that it was probably just an animal. It was probably just her imagination. But I could see that Margaret knew something. I could see that Margaret recognized that sound. Margaret said she had to tell us something. She said she had been afraid to say anything because she knew we would think she was crazy. But she said she had encountered the Talipo before, not in person, not face-to-face, but she had been present when something terrible happened, something that had brought the Talipo's wrath down upon her. Donna told her to sit down, to rest, to not upset herself. But Margaret pushed away from her, and she told her story. 50 years ago, Margaret said, when she was only 25 years old, she and some friends had been camping in these same mountains. Not in this exact spot, but not far from here either. One night while they were sleeping, one of her friends had encountered a small animal near the campfire. It had been dark, and the friend had not known what it was. The friend had thought it was a rat or a possum, some kind of pest. So the friend had taken a stick and hit at it, trying to drive it away. But it was not a rat or a possum. It was the Talipo. The creature had survived the blow, but it had been injured. It had run into the forest, making that awful wailing sound, calling out into the night. And then for 3 nights, the Talipo had come back to their campsite. It had scratched at their tents. It had wailed outside their camp. On the 3rd night, it had gotten into one of the tents and attacked one of the boys in their group. He had been badly injured, had to be taken to the hospital. He had survived, but he had scars, and he had never fully recovered from the psychological trauma. The next morning, the injuries had healed enough that they could move, so they had packed up and left immediately. They had never spoken of it again, never told anyone what had happened. They had been afraid of being thought crazy. They had been afraid of the ridicule. And as the years passed, they had almost convinced themselves that it had been a dream, some kind of shared hallucination brought on by fear and darkness. But Margaret had never forgotten. She had never forgotten the sound of that creature calling out in the night. And when I had told the Talipo story on our first night around the fire, Margaret had heard her own experience reflected in those old tales. And now, she said, she believed the Talipo had found her again. She believed it remembered her. She believed it was calling her name into the darkness. Joseph had come out of his tent during this story. Charles and Nancy had also emerged. awakened by the sound and by Margaret's voice telling her account. We all stood there listening to her words, and we all heard the truth in her voice. We all believed her. Donna said we had to get Margaret to the ranger station immediately. She said Margaret's stress levels were too high, and given her heart condition, she might have a cardiac event. Donna said we needed to get her to the station where there was a phone and where we could call for help if needed. I told everyone to pack quickly. We would all leave, I said. We would go to the ranger station now, tonight, and in the morning we would drive back to town. I said it was too dangerous to stay. It took us about 20 minutes to break camp and pack our gear into backpacks. The fire was allowed to burn down. We turned on our flashlights and we got ready to hike out of the hollow, back to the ranger station in the darkness. But before we could start, the Talipo called again. This time it was very close. The wailing cry came from somewhere just beyond the circle of light from our flashlights. And this time, we heard more than just that creature. We heard the sounds of something moving through the forest, something large, something that was running toward us. Joseph shouted at everyone to get together. We formed a tight group, all 6 of us, with our flashlights aimed outward, trying to see what was coming at us through the darkness. What we saw in that moment will never leave me. For the rest of my life, I will carry the image of what emerged from the shadows of that forest. It was small, yes, about the size of a large dog or a small coyote, but it was nothing like any animal I had ever seen before. Its head was shaped like a fox or a cat, with pointed ears and a long snout, but its face was wrong. It was too intelligent. Its eyes reflected our flashlight beams with a malevolent awareness that no animal should possess. Its body was elongated and muscular, like a weasel or a badger, and its tail, oh God, its tail was long, very long, extending behind it like a whip, tufted at the end like a lion's tail. And that tail was moving, twitching, as if it had a mind of its own. Its fur was dark, almost black, but there seemed to be something wet on it, something dark that looked like blood. The creature did not make any sound as it emerged from the forest. It simply stood there, about 30 feet from us, its unnatural eyes fixed on Margaret. It opened its mouth, and when it vocalized, it was that same wailing cry we had heard before. But this time, there was no doubt about what it was calling. It was calling a name. It was calling out the word Margaret. Margaret collapsed. She simply fell to the ground. Donna tried to catch her, but Margaret's weight was too much, and they both went down together. Charles rushed over to help them, calling out Margaret's name, asking if she was okay. The Talipo took a step toward us, then another. Joseph told everyone to run. He said to run toward the ranger station, to run now. He grabbed Charles and pulled him away from Margaret and Donna. Nancy was frozen. Her flashlight dropped to the ground, her body absolutely rigid with terror. I made the decision that I have regretted every single moment since then. I made the decision to run. I told Joseph to get Margaret and Donna and Nancy to the ranger station. I said I would stay and distract the creature, would buy them time to escape. It was a brave decision, or it was a cowardly one. I still have not decided which. So I ran toward the Talipo. I know how insane that sounds. I know that it was not a rational choice, but I was afraid, and fear does strange things to people. I was afraid that if I did not act, if I did not do something to pull the creature's attention away from Margaret, the creature would follow the others, and they would all be in danger. So I ran toward it, shouting, making noise, waving my flashlight back and forth. The creature's head swiveled toward me, its eyes fixed on my face, and I saw, in that moment, an intelligence in those eyes, a consciousness, a malevolence that was ancient and patient and utterly merciless. And then it moved. The Talipo did not run toward me. Instead, it leaped. It launched itself into the air with an athleticism that should not have been possible for an animal of its size. It came at me with its claws extended and its mouth open, and its tail came around like a whip, like a weapon. I tried to dodge, but I was not fast enough. The creature's claws raked across my chest and shoulder, tearing through my shirt and my skin. The pain was immediate and intense. The creature landed beyond me and turned to attack again, but I was running now, running toward the ranger station, running in the same direction as the others. I could hear the Talipo behind me, moving through the forest with an awful grace, and I could hear it calling, that wailing cry, calling out Margaret's name over and over. I am not sure how long the chase lasted. It might have been 5 minutes. It might have been much longer. Time seems to work differently when you are fleeing for your life through the dark forest. The branches tore at my face and arms. My feet caught on roots and rocks. I fell several times and had to scramble back to my feet. Blood ran down my chest from where the Talipo had clawed me. But I ran, and I did not stop running until I saw the lights of the ranger station through the trees. I crashed through the door and found the others already there. Joseph was supporting Margaret. Donna was trying to get Margaret to sit down. Charles and Nancy were standing frozen, their faces white with shock. There was blood on Charles's shirt from where he had tried to help Margaret. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. The others stared at me. Nancy asked where the creature was. Joseph asked if it was still coming. For a moment there was silence. The only sound was our heavy breathing, the sound of fear. And then the Talipo came. We heard it approach through the forest. We heard the padding of its footsteps, the rustling of undergrowth, the scraping of branches against its body. It circled the ranger station, and with each pass it called out, that haunting wail, that terrible voice calling Margaret's name. Margaret was on the ground, Donna kneeling beside her. Charles was asking what we should do. Joseph was looking at the windows, checking to make sure they were locked. Nancy was sobbing, her entire body shaking. The Talipo began to scratch at the walls of the cabin. Not in a random, panicked way, but deliberately, methodically. It scratched at the window frame, testing the wood, testing the glass. It went around the entire perimeter of the building, scratching and probing, looking for a way inside. All the while it called out, "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." Joseph found a heavy knife in the kitchen of the ranger station. I found a fire poker. Charles found a flashlight and made sure it was working. We stood together, armed with our meager weapons, and we waited for the Talipo to break through. The creature's call became more frantic, more desperate, more furious. The scratching at the walls became more violent. We could hear the wood splintering under those terrible claws. We could see gouges appearing in the wooden walls where the creature was trying to dig its way inside. But the ranger station held. The walls were thick and solid. The windows were strong. For all its rage and its hunger and its vengeance, the Talipo could not break through. The attacks went on for hours. Hours of scratching and wailing and calling out Margaret's name. Hours of terror as we waited to see if the creature would finally break through, if the barriers we had so hastily constructed would ultimately fail. But the creature's attacks began to slow as the night deepened. The scratching became less frequent. The calls became more distant. As dawn began to break, as the first light of morning started to filter through the windows, the Talipo's presence receded. By full light, the creature was gone, but the damage it had done was not just physical. Margaret was still alive, but she was broken. She was conscious, but she did not speak. She had been placed on one of the cots in the ranger station, and she simply lay there, staring at nothing, her eyes empty. Donna stayed beside her, monitoring her heart rate and blood pressure, worried that Margaret might have suffered a heart attack during the night. But Margaret's vitals, while elevated, seemed stable. Her body survived, but something in her mind, something fundamental, had shattered. Joseph called for help on the ranger station phone. We were still in cell phone range there, though barely. He explained to the dispatcher that we had a medical emergency and that we needed an ambulance sent to the ranger station access road as soon as possible. He did not mention the Talipo. He simply said that one of our group had experienced a serious stress-related medical event. In the light of day, with the immediate danger past, We all tried to pretend that the night had not happened exactly as we remembered it. We tried to convince ourselves that we had imagined parts of it, that fear had distorted our perceptions, that what we had seen was not quite as real as it had seemed in the darkness. But we all knew the truth. We all knew what we had encountered. We all knew that the Talipo was real. The ambulance arrived at the ranger station at about 9 o'clock in the morning. 2 paramedics examined Margaret and determined that she had not had a heart attack, but her stress levels were dangerously elevated and her blood pressure was concerning. They said she needed to get to a hospital as soon as possible. They loaded her into the ambulance and drove away with her, leaving us standing in the parking area of the ranger station, watching them leave. Donna insisted on going to the hospital with Margaret. She said she was not staying in the mountains another moment, and she did not want Margaret to be alone. She rode in the ambulance, leaving the rest of us at the ranger station. Charles wanted to leave immediately. He said we should pack up everything and drive out right then. Nancy agreed with him. But Joseph said we should call the sheriff. He said that whether anyone believed us or not, we should make an official report of what had happened. We should document it, even if the authorities thought we were crazy. I did not want to make a report. Some part of me wanted to leave this place and never speak of it again, but Joseph was right. We could not just leave. We could not pretend that nothing had happened. So Joseph called the sheriff's office, and we reported the incident. We told them that we had been attacked by an unknown animal while camping in Cumberland Hollow. We told them that one of our group had suffered a severe stress-related medical event and had been taken to the hospital. We told them that we had sought refuge at the ranger station and that the animal had attacked the building during the night. The dispatcher told us that a sheriff's deputy would be sent to the ranger station to take our full statement and to investigate the attack. This would take a few hours, so we were asked to remain at the ranger station. While we waited, I sat outside and looked at my injuries. The Talipo's claws had torn deep gouges across my chest and left shoulder. The wounds were bleeding, but not profusely. I washed them with water and applied bandages from the first aid kit. The pain was sharp and constant. Nancy asked if I thought the deputy would believe us. I told her I did not think so. I said that if I were hearing this story from someone else, I would not believe it either. The truth, the absolute truth of what we had experienced, was something that could not be conveyed in a simple police report. Charles asked if I thought the Talipo was still out there. I told him that yes, I believed it was. I believed it would remain in these mountains, haunting this hollow, waiting for Margaret. I did not know if it would ever leave. I did not know if it was immortal or if it could be killed, and I was grateful that I did not have to find out. Joseph sat quietly, reading a book as if nothing had happened, but I noticed that his hands were shaking. I noticed that he kept looking toward the door, as if he expected the Talipo to come back. None of us were truly calm. None of us were truly safe. The deputy arrived at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He was a man named Dale Harrison, probably in his mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had dealt with many different situations over many years. He listened to our story without interrupting. We told him about the dead deer on the trail. We told him about the strange tracks around our camp. We told him about the sounds we had heard in the night. We told him about the attack on the ranger station. When we told him about the Talipo, about what we had seen, I saw his expression change slightly. He asked us to describe the creature in detail. I gave him a description, trying to be as accurate as possible. Charles added details that he had noticed. Nancy described the look in the creature's eyes. When we had finished, Deputy Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if we had heard of a creature called the Talipo before our trip. I told him that yes, I had told them old folklore stories about the creature on our first night at the campsite. He asked if it was possible that our minds had created the creature out of that folklore, that fear and darkness had transformed something ordinary into something monstrous. I understood what he was saying. I understood that he was trying to find a rational explanation. I understood that the official answer had to be that we had misidentified a natural animal, possibly a bear or a mountain lion, and that our imaginations had transformed it into the folklore creature we had been thinking about. But I looked at my wounds. I looked at the gouges in the wooden walls of the ranger station. I looked at the expression on Charles's face, at Nancy's tear-stained cheeks, and I knew that what we had experienced was real. It was not a misidentification. It was not our imagination. It was the Talipo, ancient and real and terrible. Deputy Harrison took photographs of the wounds on my body. He took photographs of the gouges in the ranger station walls. He took some measurements and made some notes. He asked us if we wanted to file an official report. We told him that yes, we did. He said that the report would be filed and that an investigation would be opened into the incident. He said that Wildlife Control would be contacted and the area would be monitored. But we all knew that they would not find anything, that they would not catch the Talipo, that the creature would remain in these mountains, wild and free and terrifying. Deputy Harrison drove us back to our vehicles. We packed them quickly and did not look back at the ranger station. The drive out of Cumberland Hollow seemed to take much longer than the drive in. The roads were the same, but everything felt different. The mountains that had seemed so beautiful just days before now seemed ominous and threatening. I drove Charles back to his home. He was quiet the entire drive. When I dropped him off, he asked me if I thought things would ever go back to normal. I told him that I did not know. I told him that I did not think normal existed anymore, not after what we had experienced. Joseph and Nancy had ridden with me. After dropping off Charles, I drove Joseph home. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the landscape passing by. He said something that I have thought about many times since then. He said that the Talipo was not the monster in this story. He said that we were the monsters. He said that we had invaded the creature's territory, had disrespected the mountains and the wild places, and the Talipo was simply defending what was its. He said that his friend, the one in Margaret's old story who had struck the creature with a stick, had been the one who initiated the violence, and we had all suffered the consequences. I did not argue with him. I did not know if he was right or wrong. I simply drove him home and dropped him off. The last person I drove was Nancy. She asked if we should all stay in touch, if we should meet up and talk about what had happened. I told her that I did not think that was a good idea. I said that I thought it would be better if we all tried to move on, if we tried to put this experience behind us. She understood, and she did not argue. When I dropped Nancy off at her house, she asked if I was going to ever go back to Cumberland Hollow. I told her that I would never go back. I told her that I had surveyed many miles of these mountains, but I would never survey that hollow again. Some places, I said, should be left alone. Some places belong to the wild things that live there, and we have no right to intrude. Nancy nodded, and she got out of my vehicle and walked to her house without looking back. That was 3 months ago. It is now October, and I am writing this account to document what happened. I am writing it because Margaret is still in the hospital. The doctors have said that her condition is stable, but she will not speak. She will not eat unless she is fed. She will not look at anyone. Whatever the Talipo did to her that night, it was not just physical. It was a violation of her mind and her spirit. Donna has been at her bedside every single day. Donna has not given up on her. Donna believes that Margaret will eventually recover, that she will come back to herself. I hope that Donna is right, but I do not think she is. Charles went back to his solitary life after the trip. He works in his yard and feeds the birds and stares out at the mountains. Joseph has kept the hardware store open, but I do not think his heart is in it anymore. He seems to be just going through the motions. Nancy has not been back to school. She took a leave of absence, and I heard that she is considering relocating, leaving the mountains entirely. As for me, I have not worked since we returned. I have tried to go back out on surveying jobs, but I find that I cannot focus. I find that I am afraid. I find that I see the Talipo in every shadow, hear its call in every strange sound the forest makes. I have applied for a position at the county planning office, an indoor job, a job that will not require me to spend my days in the wilderness. The mountains have rejected me. The wild country has marked me, and I am no longer welcome there. But I am not sure if this story will be believed. I am not sure if anyone will read this account and think it is anything other than fiction, a tall tale, a campfire story designed to frighten. That is fine. I do not need anyone to believe me, but I need to warn others. I need people to know that if they venture into the wild places of Appalachia, if they go into remote hollows and high ridges and dark forests, they need to be careful. They need to respect the land. They need to remember that there are things out there in the darkness that we do not fully understand, that we do not have names for, that exist in the folklore and the stories of mountain people for very good reasons. The Talipo is real. I have seen it. I have felt the rake of its claws. I have heard it call, and I will carry the knowledge of its reality for the rest of my life. Margaret saw something too, something even more terrible than what the rest of us saw. Whatever the Talipo did to her, whatever it made her experience, was enough to shatter her mind. And because of that, I have come to believe that the creature's hunger and its wrath are not something that can be easily understood or rationalized. The old story said that if you harm the Talipo, if you injure it, it will come for you. It will pursue you across years and decades. It will not forget. It will not forgive. It will call your name into the darkness until you answer. Margaret answered, and the price she paid was her sanity. I do not know if the Talipo will ever forgive her for what happened 50 years ago. I do not know if it will ever release her from its vengeance. But I know that it is still out there in Cumberland Hollow, still hunting, still calling, still waiting for the next person who ventures into its territory, unprepared and unaware of the danger. I know that there are other Talipos, or other creatures like them, in other hollows and mountains and wild places throughout Appalachia. The folklore speaks of them. The old stories carry their names, and the mountains keep their secrets carefully, revealing them only to those foolish enough to venture into the darkness. If you are reading this, and if you are thinking about camping in the Appalachian Mountains, if you are thinking about hiking into remote areas, if you are thinking about exploring the wilderness, I am asking you to be careful. I am asking you to respect the land. I am asking you to remember that the mountains are not a playground. They are a living presence, ancient and powerful, and there are things in those mountains that have hunted and lived there for longer than we can imagine. Do not invoke their names. Do not mock the old stories. Do not assume that folklore is merely fiction, because folklore often carries truth embedded within it, and the Talipo is one of those truths that we must always remember and always respect. My name is Thomas Walker, and I am telling you this because I survived. Against all odds, against all reason, I survived the encounter with the Talipo, but I did not escape unscathed. None of us did. And I will spend the rest of my life knowing that somewhere in Cumberland Hollow, on some dark night when the wind is blowing and the moon is hidden and the forest is full of shadows, the Talipo is still calling. It is still hunting. It is still waiting. And its wail, that horrible, haunting, impossibly human wail, will echo through those mountains forever. This is my account. This is what I witnessed. This is the truth. May God have mercy on us all. My name is James Carter, and I am writing this account because I believe that what happened to our group in Point Pleasant during that summer needed to be documented. I have wrestled with whether I should share this story at all, but the weight of silence has become unbearable. This is the truth of what we witnessed, and I tell it now without embellishment or exaggeration. It was July of 2019 when my wife Susan first suggested the trip. She had been researching outdoor destinations for months, and Point Pleasant, West Virginia had captured her imagination. The town had a certain mystique about it, she explained. There was history there, folklore, natural beauty that drew people who understood the value of stepping away from civilization. I should have recognized the warning signs in her fascination with the place, but I did not. I was 45 years old then, working as an engineer in Charleston. The job had drained me for years. Long hours in an office, meetings that accomplished nothing, projects that never quite reached completion. I jumped at the idea of a week in the wilderness. Susan was 38, still vibrant and full of energy despite the demands of her own career as a high school teacher. She had a way of making even mundane activities feel like adventures, and I fell into her excitement about this expedition. We decided to invite others. James Carter and Susan Davis became the core of our group, but we needed more people. Robert Miller, who was 60 years old and had been a forest ranger for most of his adult life, was the first to commit. Robert had a gruff demeanor but an encyclopedic knowledge of the outdoors. He brought with him decades of experience and a certain gravitas that made me feel safer just by his presence. His wife, Patricia, agreed to join us as well. Patricia was 65, calm and methodical in everything she did, the kind of woman who made lists for her lists. She was a nurse by training and had an almost supernatural ability to remain composed in difficult situations. Our group grew by two more. Linda Johnson, 52 and recently divorced, needed an escape from her old life in Pittsburgh. She had been friends with Susan since college and jumped at the opportunity to reconnect. Then there was Michael Brown, 70 years old and retired, who mentioned to Robert at a community center that he was feeling restless. Michael had been a military man in his youth, and that discipline had never left him. He carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to taking charge. 6 of us in total. 3 couples, if you could call us that. Robert and Patricia had been married for 40 years. Susan and I were approaching our 10th anniversary. Linda was unattached, but had known several of us for years. Michael was widowed and had become somewhat of a loner, which is perhaps why the isolation appealed to him. We rented a lodge about 7 miles outside of Point Pleasant, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest. The lodging website described it as a rustic retreat for nature enthusiasts. What it actually was, we would come to understand, was an isolated structure miles from any real civilization. The drive from Charleston took us through increasingly rural areas. Towns became smaller, roads became narrower, and civilization seemed to retreat behind us with each passing mile. The lodge itself was larger than I expected, a 3-story structure built in the 1970s. It had a wraparound porch, massive windows overlooking the forest, and a central fireplace that rose through the middle of the building like the spine of some ancient creature. The owner, a taciturn woman named Margaret, showed us around with minimal commentary. She pointed out the kitchen, the bedrooms, the locked storage shed out back where we could keep supplies. "Do not venture into the forest after dark," she said as she handed over the keys. It was the most she had spoken since greeting us. "Why is that?" Linda asked, laughing nervously. "Bears?" Margaret looked at her with an expression I could not quite read. "There are reasons this valley is not heavily developed. Reasons the land around here has been left mostly wild. You should respect those reasons." I tried to ask for clarification, but Margaret had already left, her pickup truck disappearing down the long driveway before I could form the question. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. We hiked along established trails, pointing out flora and fauna to one another, taking photographs and feeling the stress of our regular lives melt away. Michael told stories of his time in the military. Patricia shared nursing anecdotes that were somehow both horrifying and hilarious. Linda and Susan would walk ahead, talking and laughing about old times and old friends. The forest around Point Pleasant was different from other places I had visited. It felt older somehow, as though the trees had been growing there since the beginning of time. The vegetation was dense and tangled, the underbrush thick enough that wandering off the trail seemed impossible. When I mentioned this to Robert during one hike, he nodded gravely. "These hills have been here a long time," he said. "The land remembers what has happened on it. You learn to feel that when you spend enough years in places like this." I thought he was being philosophical, waxing poetic about nature and time. I did not understand that he was trying to warn me. It was on the fourth evening that things began to change. We had all gathered on the lodge's back porch, drinks in hand, watching the sun descend behind the tree line. The sky had turned a peculiar shade of orange, darker and more saturated than normal. The forest beyond our clearing seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, becoming less distinct and more mysterious as twilight approached. Michael was the first to point it out. His military training had left him attentive to details. "There is something up there," he said, gesturing toward the highest part of the ridge that overlooked our lodge, "on that outcropping. Something large." We all looked. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadows merging together in the fading light. But then I saw it too, a shape, a silhouette against the darkening sky. It was perched on the rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile away, and it was massive. The size made it difficult to process. It could not be a deer or a bear. It had the shape of something with wings, folded against its back like a great cloak. "What is that?" Susan whispered. "A large bird," Patricia said uncertainly. "An eagle, perhaps. A vulture." But even as she said it, I knew that no bird I had ever seen was that enormous. The wingspan, when I tried to estimate it, seemed to be at least 10 feet, possibly more. The silhouette shifted slightly, and I realized it was watching us. The realization sent a spike of cold fear through my chest. "Let us go inside," Robert said quietly. His voice carried an authority that made no one argue. We filed back through the porch door, and Robert locked it behind us with a decisive click. Inside, the lodge felt smaller and less welcoming than it had before. The large windows that had seemed charming in daylight now felt like vulnerable points, transparent barriers between us and the vast forest. We drew the curtains in the main rooms, and the lodge suddenly became a cave of warm lamplight surrounded by encroaching shadow. "It was probably just a large bird," Linda said, but her voice was uncertain. "An eagle or something." "No," Michael said flatly. "I have hunted most of my life. I know what large birds look like. That was not a bird in any conventional sense. There are cryptids in the area," Patricia said carefully. She was looking at Robert, and I realized they had discussed this before. Local folklore, legends, nothing documented or confirmed. "What kind of cryptids?" I asked. Robert and Patricia exchanged a look. Michael settled into a chair, his weathered face grave. It was Linda who finally spoke. "Mothman," she said. "The Point Pleasant Mothman. It is a local legend. In the 60s there were sightings, dozens of them. A creature with enormous wings and red eyes. People saw it repeatedly. It became a tourist attraction, drawing paranormal investigators and curiosity seekers. Then the sightings stopped, and the legend faded." "Why did you not mention this before?" Susan asked, her hand gripping mine tightly. "Because I did not believe it was relevant," Robert said. "The sightings were over 50 years ago. The creature, if it ever existed, was long gone, or it never existed at all, and the town manufactured a legend for tourist revenue. Either way, this is modern times. We have science and understanding now. I did not want to pollute this trip with folklore and superstition. And yet we all saw something," Michael pointed out. "We saw something," Robert agreed. "That does not necessarily mean it was anything extraordinary. The human mind is prone to pattern recognition. In low light, with the suggestion already planted in our minds by Linda mentioning the legend, we saw something and interpreted it as something frightening and unusual. It was a logical explanation, and I wanted to accept it. I wanted to believe that what we had seen was nothing more than a large bird or an optical illusion created by fading light and expectant minds. But I had seen the shapeshift. I had seen what I was convinced was intentionality in the way it had positioned itself on that outcropping, facing toward us, watching. We had dinner that night in the lodge's dining room, a long table that suddenly felt too exposed despite the drawn curtains. Conversation was stilted. Everyone was thinking about what we had seen, even if they were not saying so. Patricia suggested we play cards, and we agreed with perhaps more enthusiasm than the suggestion warranted. Anything to keep our minds occupied and our group together in the light. We played until nearly midnight. I won most of the hands, though I remember almost nothing about the games themselves. My focus was on the windows, on the sounds outside. The forest at night made noises I had not anticipated. Rustling, clicking, distant calls that seemed to be conversations between unseen creatures. Each sound made me tense, waiting to hear something else, something worse. When we finally retired to our bedrooms, I was exhausted, but not in a way that promised sleep. Susan was frightened, though she tried to hide it. She held on to me in the darkness of our room, both of us listening to the forest beyond our windows. The curtains we had drawn offered some sense of security, but it was largely illusory. We were still in the forest, surrounded by it, contained by it. I did eventually sleep, and when I did, I dreamed of wings spreading across the sky, blotting out the stars. I dreamed of enormous eyes, red and glowing, looking down at me with an intelligence that was utterly alien. I woke several times in the night, my heart pounding, uncertain if the sounds I heard were real or echoes from my dreams. The morning brought a kind of relief, but it was temporary and fragile. The sun rose over the forest, and the world seemed to reset to something like normalcy. Robert suggested we take a longer hike, following a trail that led deeper into the wilderness. It was a full-day hike, he said, maybe 6 or 7 miles round trip, through some of the most pristine parts of the forest. I think now that Robert was trying to prove something. He wanted to demonstrate that the forest was safe, that our fears were unfounded, that we could move through this landscape without trepidation. Perhaps he also wanted to maintain control of the narrative of our trip. If we acted normally, if we pushed forward, then the sighting from the previous evening would be diminished, rationalized, forgotten. Michael was the only one who questioned the plan. We should stay closer to the lodge, he said, stick to areas we already know. But Robert was the experienced outdoorsman, the one with decades of forest knowledge. His confidence was persuasive. We packed backpacks with water and snacks, applied sunscreen, and set out from the lodge at 8 in the morning. The trail led us deeper into the forest, away from the ridge where we had seen the creature. The sun filtered through the canopy in beautiful shifting patterns. The air was cool and moist, smelling of earth and growing things. For a while, I forgot about the thing we had seen. I walked beside Susan, and we talked about everything except the previous evening. Patricia walked ahead with Linda, while Michael and Robert brought up the rear. We had been hiking for maybe 2 hours when the forest began to change. The trees grew older, their trunks thicker, their bark darker and more textured. The undergrowth thinned, leaving vast stretches of only damp earth beneath our feet, and the sounds changed. The small rustlings and calls that had filled the morning gradually faded. The forest became increasingly silent. "This is strange," Robert said quietly. He had stopped on the trail, and we all gathered around him. "The wildlife should be more active in mid-morning. The silence is unusual. Maybe they are avoiding us," Patricia suggested. "Animals often do." But Robert shook his head. "This is a different kind of silence, a deliberate absence, like something is suppressing the natural sounds of the forest." We continued, but more slowly. The unease that we had gone to sleep with the previous night was returning, amplified now by the strange hush around us. Michael kept checking behind us, his posture alert and tense. I found myself doing the same. After another hour of hiking, we came to a clearing. It was not large, maybe 50 feet across, but it felt significant. In the center of the clearing was an enormous rock formation, a cluster of boulders stacked in an almost intentional-seeming arrangement. Around the base of these rocks, the earth was disturbed, as if something large had been moving around it repeatedly. "There have been animals here," Robert said, kneeling to examine the ground. "Recently, multiple times." "What kind of animal?" Susan asked. Robert stood, and his face was troubled. "I am not certain. The tracks do not match anything I recognize. They are large, clawed, but the pattern is wrong. The gait is wrong. The longer we stood in that clearing, the more wrongness I sensed. The air felt heavy. The light seemed dimmer than it should have been. When I looked up at the sky through the canopy, the clouds had moved in without my noticing. The bright morning had become something more overcast and subdued. "We should go back," Michael said. It was not a suggestion. We turned around on the trail, but Robert wanted to examine the rocks more closely. He said it would only take a few minutes. He was the expert, after all. We stood at the edge of the clearing while Robert walked around the boulder formation, taking photographs with his phone and making notes. That was when Linda first saw it. She was standing slightly apart from the rest of us, looking off to her left, when she gasped. "There," she said, pointing. "Do you see it?" At first I saw nothing. Then Patricia grabbed my arm. Oh my God. In the trees at the far edge of the clearing, something was moving. It was huge, far larger than any animal should be. Its body was obscured by the trees, but I could see its wings. They were partially extended, vast and membranous, with a texture that seemed almost leathery. I could make out the joints and muscles of the wing structure, and I understood with horrible clarity that this was not a bird. This was something else entirely. Robert emerged from among the rocks. "Everyone back to the trail. Now." We did not run, though every instinct screamed at me to do so. We moved quickly but deliberately, keeping our eyes on the creature at the forest edge. It did not pursue us. It simply stood there, those enormous wings beginning to unfold further, revealing a body that I still could not quite see clearly, as though the thing existed partially outside my range of perception. We hiked back the way we had come, moving faster now, our earlier sense of peaceful exploration entirely replaced by focused fear. No one spoke. The only sounds were our footsteps and our breathing. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the forest, pacing us, keeping pace with our retreat. It was not directly behind us. It was off to the side, moving through the forest as though the trees offered no resistance. I could hear its movements, the sounds of its massive bulk displacing air and branches, but when I looked directly at where the sounds came from, I could not see it clearly. It was there, and not there, visible peripherally, but vanishing when I tried to focus on it. We made it back to the lodge in something under 2 hours, having covered the hike that had taken us more than 4 hours on the way out. No one was running, but we were all moving with the kind of speed that comes from pure adrenaline and fear. Inside, Robert locked every door and window. He did it methodically, checking each lock twice, even the ones that were clearly secure. His hands shook as he worked. "We are leaving," Michael said flatly. "Today. Now. We pack our things and we drive away from this place. We have reservations for the entire week," Patricia said weakly. "We paid in advance." "I do not care about the money," Michael said. "Money means nothing. That thing is real. It is here. It is hunting us." "We do not know that," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We do not know what it wants or if it even knows we are here." "It knows," Linda said quietly. She was sitting on one of the lodge's couches, staring at nothing. "It watched us in the clearing. It knows we are here, and it is keeping us here." "That is not possible," Patricia said, but it sounded like she was trying to convince herself. Susan brought me water, and I realized I was shaking. My hands would not keep steady. Everything I had seen in the clearing was running through my mind on a loop. The size of those wings, the sense of ancient intelligence behind those unseen eyes. We spent the afternoon in discussion, with opinions divided. Michael and Linda wanted to leave immediately. Robert and Patricia wanted to wait until the next morning, believing that driving through unfamiliar territory at night was more dangerous than staying put. Susan was uncertain, leaning toward leaving but not wanting to seem cowardly. It was Michael who noticed the phones first. "I have no signal," he said. "Nothing. No bars at all." We checked. None of us had any cellular signal. It was not unusual for a remote area, but the timing seemed suspicious. We had all had signal when we arrived. Spotty, yes, but present. Robert checked the lodge's landline telephone. It was dead. Not even a dial tone. The lines might be down, Patricia suggested. Storm damage or maintenance. But there had been no storm. The weather had been clear all day except for the clouds that had appeared just before we saw the creature. As evening approached, the lodge seemed to become more of a prison and less of a sanctuary. The windows, even with the curtains drawn, felt vulnerable. Every sound from the forest outside made us all tense. We had dinner quietly, no one discussing what was really on everyone's minds. It was full night when we heard the first call. It came from somewhere in the forest beyond the lodge, a sound that was almost like a bird call, but far too low and far too complex. It started as a kind of clicking chirp and rose into something that resembled a cry, a mourning wail that seemed to carry genuine emotion. It was answered immediately by another call from a different direction, and then another. There were multiple creatures out there, communicating with one another. "Oh, God," Linda whispered. Robert turned off all the lights in the main room. "Do not react. Do not move. We do not know if the lights inside draw them." We sat in the darkness, listening to the calls continue. They formed patterns, almost like language, rhythmic, structured, clearly intentional. I found myself trying to interpret meaning in the sounds, trying to understand what they might be saying to one another. It was a foolish impulse. Whatever they were saying had nothing to do with human understanding or human language. The calls moved closer to the lodge. I could hear movement outside, heavy footsteps that would be silent for a while and then resume. It sounded like there were at least 3 of them, moving around the structure in a coordinated way. "They are checking the perimeter," Michael said quietly, "assessing the building, the way predators do when they are considering attacking a fortified position." "They are not attacking," Robert said, but he did not sound confident. The creatures continued their perimeter patrol for hours. Every so often, one would let out that terrible call, and the others would answer. The sounds were gradually becoming familiar to me, which was somehow worse than if they remained alien. I was learning their voices, learning to distinguish between individuals. Sometime after midnight, Michael went to one of the windows and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to look out. I heard him gasp. When he turned back to us, his face was pale. "They are sitting," he said, "all around the lodge, sitting and watching." "How many?" Robert asked. "I can only see 3 clearly, but I think there are more. I think they are beyond what I can see in the darkness." "They are waiting for something," Patricia said. Her voice had taken on a strange quality, almost as if she was narrating observations rather than participating in the horror of our situation. Her nursing training, perhaps, had taught her to create distance from trauma through clinical description. We did not sleep that night. We sat in the darkness of the lodge and listened to the creatures outside. Occasionally one would let out a call or there would be movement, but for the most part they simply waited. I spent the hours trying to make sense of what was happening. What did they want? Why were they not attacking? Were they intelligent enough to understand that breaking through the lodge's walls would require more effort than they were willing to expend? Or were they keeping us here for some other purpose? As the first light of dawn began to break, the sound stopped. The creatures went silent, and then, one by one, they retreated into the forest. By the time the sun had actually risen, there was no sign of them at all. Robert immediately began trying to fix the telephone, opening panels and checking wiring. It was non-functional, not due to any external damage, but because someone, or something, had deliberately disconnected it inside the lodge. "They were inside," Patricia said. Her voice was steady, but I could see the terror in her eyes. "While we sat in the darkness, they were inside the lodge. That morning, we made a decision. We would hike out. The lodge was no longer a shelter. It had been breached. The creatures knew where we were, and staying put was no longer safe. We would take the only road out of the valley, hiking approximately 7 miles to the nearest town. The distance was significant, but it was a straight path. The creatures seemed to prefer the deep forest. They might leave us alone if we stayed on the road. It was a desperate plan, built on logic that was mostly hope and fear. But the alternative was to stay in the lodge and wait for another night, and no one was willing to do that. We packed quickly, taking only what we could carry: water, snacks, basic first aid supplies, and our car keys. We did not know if we would make it to the car, or if the vehicle would even start after the previous night's intrusions. The walk out to the main road seemed to take forever. We moved as a group, clustered together, staying on the path that had been worn by the lodge's previous guests and maintenance staff. The forest around us felt malevolent now, every shadow a threat, every sound a potential warning. Michael led, constantly watching ahead. Robert was at the rear, periodically looking backward. Susan held my hand tightly, and I could feel her trembling. Linda and Patricia walked between us, Patricia still maintaining that strange clinical detachment. We had walked for maybe a mile when Linda suddenly pointed ahead. The road. We could see it through the trees, the gravel and dirt road that led back toward civilization. We quickened our pace, relief beginning to flood through me. We might actually make it. We might actually escape. But as we reached the edge of the forest, where it opened onto the road, we all stopped. The road ahead was blocked by a creature. It was not hidden or camouflaged. It stood in the middle of the road, roughly 40 feet ahead of us, completely visible in the morning light. And now I could see it clearly for the first time. The body was humanoid, roughly 7 feet tall, with a muscular physique covered in what appeared to be dark fur or skin with a leathery texture. The wings were folded against its back, but even folded, they rose well above its head, adding another 4 or 5 feet to its overall height. But it was the face that froze every muscle in my body. It had eyes, large, luminous red eyes that glowed with an internal light. They were fixed on me with an intensity that was palpable. Behind those eyes was intelligence, ancient and vast, and utterly inhuman. It was a gaze that contained the weight of centuries of consciousness, of knowledge far beyond human comprehension. The creature did not move. It simply stood there, watching us. Watching me specifically, I realized. The eyes had locked onto mine and would not release. "Back up," Michael whispered. Slowly. "Back up." But I could not move. I could not look away from those red eyes. In their glow I could see meaning, a message being communicated directly into my mind without words. The creature was showing me something, images that flashed through my consciousness faster than I could process them. I saw the town of Point Pleasant as it had been in the 1960s, and I saw the creature there, circling the town night after night, appearing to hundreds of people. I saw the fear it had caused, the chaos, the strange madness that had seized the population. And I understood that the creature had been trying to communicate even then. It had been trying to warn them. Warn them of what? I could not understand, but the urgency was unmistakable. Then I saw Point Pleasant in the present day, in the summer of 2019, and the town was empty. Not abandoned, but empty in a way that meant the humans there were asleep in their beds, unconscious, unaware, and I understood that they would never wake. That the creature had come back now for a purpose, and that purpose was nearly complete. Susan was screaming. Her voice cut through the connection between me and the creature's eyes. I gasped and felt the contact break. The vision ceased. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if disappointed at the interruption. "Run!" Michael shouted, and we ran. We bolted back into the forest, away from the road, away from the creature. There was no plan, no strategy. We simply ran, driven by pure panic and the recognition that something fundamental and terrible was happening. The forest became a maze of trees and undergrowth. Behind us, I could hear the creature pursuing. It did not run. It did not seem to move particularly quickly, but it was relentless, and it was not alone. More of them entered the forest from other directions, cutting off our retreat, hurting us. We found ourselves in a ravine, a deep canyon carved by some ancient stream. The walls were steep, nearly vertical in places, We scrambled down them, desperate to put distance between ourselves and our pursuers. At the bottom of the ravine was a cave, a dark opening in the cliff face, promising shelter or concealment. Robert did not hesitate. He urged us inside, and we plunged into the darkness, feeling our way along the stone walls, moving deeper and deeper into the earth. Behind us, the creatures did not follow. We could hear them at the mouth of the cave, calling to one another in those complex, rhythmic sounds, but they did not enter. They stood guard, waiting. The cave had become our final refuge, and it was becoming our tomb. After our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we found that the cave was not a simple cavern. It was a passage, sloping deeper into the earth. Robert used his lighter to illuminate our way, and we followed the passage, hoping it would lead somewhere, anywhere, away from the creatures. The air grew cooler and damper as we descended. The passage widened, and we entered a larger chamber. And in that chamber, illuminated by Robert's lighter, we saw something that made everything else we had experienced seem like a preamble. The chamber was vast, perhaps 200 feet across. The walls were covered in carvings, ancient carvings depicting the creatures, the Mothmen, in various poses and activities, and carved into the stone were human figures, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all arranged in concentric circles around what appeared to be an altar of sorts. "What is this place?" Patricia asked, her voice barely audible. Michael was staring at one of the walls, at a series of carvings that seemed to depict a progression. "This is a religious site," he said quietly, "a temple. These creatures have been worshipped here for centuries, possibly longer." "How is that possible?" Linda asked. "This is America. This is not some remote part of Asia or Africa. The indigenous peoples," Robert said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "The Native Americans who lived in this area before the settlements. They knew about these creatures. They built this place. They left these carvings as a record." I was studying the altar now, and my blood ran cold. There were stone tables arranged on its surface. Offering tables, I realized with horror, places where things had been placed for the creatures. The carvings showed it clearly. Human offerings. This had been a place of worship and sacrifice. We heard it then, a sound from deeper in the cave, a sound that was neither animal nor human. It was a kind of breathing sound, regular and deep. Something huge was sleeping in the depths of this chamber, and it was waking. The tremors started as small vibrations in the stone beneath our feet, but they quickly grew in intensity. Dust and small pebbles cascaded down from the ceiling. The creatures we had been fleeing, the ones standing guard at the cave entrance, began to call out again, but their calls now carried a different tone. Excitement, reverence, worship. I understood in that moment that we had been herded here deliberately. The creatures had guided us to this place, to this temple, and they had done so for a reason. The carvings on the walls told the story. They showed humans being brought here, humans standing before the altar, humans being transformed or taken or both. Robert grabbed my arm. "We have to find another way out," he said urgently. "There might be other passages." We searched frantically, but there was only one entrance to the chamber, the passage through which we had entered, and at that entrance we could now see the silhouettes of the creatures, blocking our exit completely. The sound from the depths of the chamber grew louder, the tremors intensified, and then a scream echoed from somewhere in the darkness behind the altar, a scream that sounded like it came from a human throat. Michael moved toward the sound, but Robert stopped him. "No, it is a trap. They are using sound to draw us deeper." "We cannot stay here," Michael said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Then we will have to find a way past them," Robert said, and he began moving toward the cave entrance, where the creatures stood waiting. I followed him, as did the others. We had no weapons, no defenses, no real plan. We simply moved toward the creatures, and as we approached, they parted, allowing us passage. They did not seem interested in us anymore. Their attention was focused on what was happening in the depths of the chamber. We emerged from the cave into the daylight of the ravine. The forest beyond seemed almost welcoming in comparison to what we had just witnessed. We climbed the ravine walls and made our way back toward the road. When we reached the main path, we found the lodging manager, Margaret, standing there, waiting for us. She looked exactly as she had when she had shown us the lodge, completely unperturbed by our wild appearance or the obvious trauma we had experienced. "So you have found it," she said. It was not a question. "What is that place?" Robert demanded. "What are those creatures?" "They are an old agreement," Margaret said. "The town made a deal a long time ago. The creatures would protect the valley, would keep certain things from entering this world from the places that surround it. In exchange, the town provided tribute." "You mean sacrifice," Patricia said. "You mean people." "A few each year," Margaret said calmly. "The homeless, the transient, the ones that no one would miss. A small price for security. The Mothmen have kept this valley safe from things far worse than themselves for over 3 centuries. "This is insane," Linda said. "You are talking about murder." "I am talking about pragmatism," Margaret replied. "The protection has held. The town has prospered. The creatures are content. Everyone survives except for a few insignificant lives. It is a fair trade." "The people in town," I said, "they are asleep. They will not wake." Margaret looked at me with something like pity. "The Mothmen are consuming them," she said. "They are taking them into the temple, into the place where the old agreement was made. They are incorporating the humans into their collective consciousness, preparing them for what is coming." "What is coming?" Michael demanded. "The awakening," Margaret said. "What sleeps in the depths of the temple will wake soon. It has been sleeping for centuries, bound by the agreement and the sacrifices. But agreements break down. The number of sacrifices has not been sufficient lately. The old families have moved away, or they have broken the ritual. The barrier is weakening." "What is it?" Robert asked. "What sleeps in that temple?" But Margaret did not answer. She simply walked past us, heading toward the forest. As she went, she said, "You should leave this place. Drive away and do not look back. Tell no one what you have seen here. If you do, if anyone investigates what has happened in Point Pleasant, the Mothmen will have to accelerate their plans. They will have to wake it before they are ready. And if it wakes prematurely, unprepared, it will be far, far worse for the world than any orderly succession." She disappeared into the forest then, and we never saw her again. We drove away from Point Pleasant that day, taking the main highway away from the valley as fast as we could safely drive. None of us spoke during that drive. Susan held my hand the entire time, but even her touch could not break the paralysis that had settled over us. When we reached Charleston, we went to a hospital, Patricia insisted. None of us were physically injured, but we were all in shock. The doctors could find nothing medically wrong with us. They recommended counseling, psychiatric evaluation, but no one followed through. What could we tell a psychiatrist? That we had been herded by flying humanoid creatures into an ancient temple where a town was being consumed to feed something ancient and powerful sleeping in the earth? In the weeks that followed, I researched everything I could find about Point Pleasant's history. The Mothman sightings of the 1960s were well documented, but there was something else, too. A pattern of disappearances in the area going back centuries. The indigenous peoples of the region had vanished relatively quickly after European settlement. The historical records were unclear about why. There were references to the land being considered cursed or haunted by the settlers, and they had largely avoided it. I found references to Margaret, too, or at least references to someone by that name managing properties in the valley going back decades. The same face, apparently unchanged over 40 or 50 years, in old property records and tax documents. I tried to go back to my normal life, but it had been fundamentally altered. I see things differently now. I notice patterns in current events that I previously would have ignored. I see news of missing persons reports, of people vanishing in remote areas, and I wonder if they are connected to what we witnessed in Point Pleasant. I wonder if it is happening in other places too. Other towns with their own agreements with ancient things, their own Mothmen keeping watch over gates that should never open. I have never returned to Point Pleasant. I never will. Neither have the others in our group, as far as I know. Robert and Patricia moved to Florida. Michael lives in a care facility now, his military bearing having given way to an almost catatonic state. Susan and I are still together, but we rarely speak about what happened. It exists between us as a shared trauma that we cannot quite process or heal from. Linda disappeared about 4 months after our trip. The police investigated briefly and came to no conclusions. I believe that the Mothmen came for her, that she somehow remained connected to them after our escape, and that they needed her for their purposes. I will never know for certain. I have written this account because I need to bear witness. I need to document what happened, even if no one believes me, even if I am dismissed as delusional or traumatized. The thing sleeping in the temple is real, and it is waking. I can feel it. The dream started about 6 months ago. Dreams of a vast intelligence spreading through the earth, consciousness expanding like roots through soil, searching for weaknesses in the barrier that separates our world from the place where it has slept. The Mothmen are preparing for its arrival. They are gathering humans into the temple systems beneath towns across the region. They are expanding the network of caves and passages. They are making ready. I do not know when it will wake. The Mothmen spoke of it in terms of seasons or tides, not years. But when it does, I believe the world as we understand it will change fundamentally. The Mothmen were only ever a symptom, a guardian species created or bound to serve a purpose larger than themselves. I write this knowing that I may be putting myself in danger by sharing these details, but I also know that if I keep this secret, if I stay silent, I am complicit in what is to come. I am another Margaret, prioritizing safety and normalcy over truth. To anyone reading this, if you go to Point Pleasant, if you enter those forests, if you find yourself in places where the barriers between worlds grow thin, you will see signs. You will see the Mothmen. When you do not try to escape. Do not try to fight. Instead, remember that there are things far older and far more powerful than humanity operating in the spaces we ignore and dismiss. Remember that sometimes the legends are not just stories. Remember that sometimes there are very good reasons why certain places are avoided and certain nights belong to things we do not understand. I am James Carter, and this is my testimony to what I witnessed in the summer of 2019 in the valley of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Whether anyone believes me or not no longer matters. The thing in the temple is waking, and we are all running out of time. The sound comes to me in dreams now, that deep breathing from the depths of the earth. It is closer than it was before. Soon it will be close enough to hear while awake. Soon it will be close enough to touch.